Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 505, and I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Before I get into the news today, I need to mention that we are holding our end of the year fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. We have raised a few $1,000s so far, and we are really just kicking off and getting it started this week. So head on over to the Libertarian Institute, and if you can, make a donation. We are doing a ton of work there. Publishing books, we have many coming out soon, including new books by James Bovard, Thomas Woods, and Scott Horton. We have articles and new content every day, so featured articles on the site from a great group of writers, including Bovard, who I just mentioned, Sheldon Richmond, Lori Calhoun, Kim Robinson, and just tons of other great writers. And then I put out news stories every day for the Institute, as well as put together a daily news roundup. And Conflicts of Interest is one of the great group of shows that we have at the Libertarian Institute, including Keith Knight's show, and he also has a book coming out soon. So just so much stuff to brag about. It's hard to keep track of everything. And if you want to help us to make sure that we could keep doing all this great stuff, head on over to the Institute and make a donation today. We have some kitbats for donors, and it'd be a great time to donate some money and get yourself a copy of Sheldon Richmond's Coming to Palestine book. Given everything that's going on in the world, there's a really great history there to help you catch up on what's been happening and what happened in what is now known as Israel over the past century, essentially. All right, and with that, if you can't donate, understand times are tough for a lot of people, but if you could just share the show or put it out there in some way to help us get a little bit bigger, I'd really appreciate it. And let's get into the news. The first story today: the Senate plans to hold its vote on Ukraine and Israel aid as early as next week. So this is a statement from Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and said he hopes to hold the vote on the week of December 4th. When he announced that the vote would be held then, he said, "Nothing would make autocrats like Putin or Xi happier right now than to see the United States waver in our support for the Ukrainian people and its military. This is not about Ukraine or transatlantic security. It's about American security, as well as an unchecked Putin would be an emboldened Putin." Now, of course, we've debunked this kind of logic so many times over the show over the past 20 months, where all these American politicians try to pretend that we have to defend Ukraine because, for some reason, once Putin gets to Kiev, then suddenly they're going to be carrying out attacks on America and putting American security in jeopardy. They can't prove it. It's not actually true, but it's just fear mongering, and that's what they're focused on. So, remember, this is the massive $105 billion bill that the White House is seeking, and what they want is $60 billion for Ukraine, $14 billion for Israel, and then money for the Asia Pacific military buildup. So this is going to go to Taiwan, Guam. I'm building up American bases in the region, maybe Australia, Japan, South Korea, all these countries that tend to get this money. And also, the Republicans want to add, I think, another $12 billion to that part of the package. And so that would put that aid for the military buildup up, I think, $19-20 billion as well. And then there's also money in there, I think, over $10 billion for the southern border, and to hire more border security guards and things like that. So this comes as the White House is running low on funds to arm Ukraine. There were several pools of money that the White House was drawing from in order to send arms to Ukraine. You had the Ukrainian Security Assistance Initiative, which allows the U.S. to buy arms from defense companies for Ukraine. You had the State Department funding, which allowed them to buy arms for Ukraine or just send American arms to Ukraine. And then you had the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which is actually depleted. However, over the summer, the Pentagon came up with a $6.2 billion what they call accounting error that gave them access to new funds to continue to use the PDA. So that is still being used. And then, of course, it's worth mentioning that they're looking to pass this bill in arms for Israel, as Tel Aviv is using American bombs to just decimate Gaza. And we'll talk about how cruel that has been a little later here in the show. Next up here, This is an article that I wrote for antiwar.com on November 25th. Ukrainian official confirms Russia was ready to end the war in March of 2022 if Kiev agreed to neutrality. So this is a statement made by David Arkamia, and he is a high-ranking member of Zelensky's Servant of the People's political party. And he said that Kiev could have ended the war with Russia after a month if it agreed not to join NATO. The official said that Moscow was not concerned about other issues, such as denazification, but only wanted Kiev to agree to neutrality. So this was in an interview with channel 1+1, and that's a Ukrainian network. And Arkamia confirmed previous reporting that Moscow and Kiev had nearly ended the war in March of 22. Still, Ukraine's Western backers pushed it to try to win the war against Russia. And so here, let's get into some of the things he said in that interview. One of his statements, they really hoped almost to the last moment that they would force us to sign an agreement so that we would take neutrality. It was the most important thing for them. They were prepared to end the war if we agreed, as Finland once did, to neutrality, and committed that we would not join NATO. So he went on to say, and this, by the way, was a man who led the negotiation team in Istanbul. So he is not speaking in any way out of term here. He was personally there for these talks. He went on to say that other issues such as protection of ethnic Russians in Ukraine and the denazification of the government in Kiev were less important to Moscow. In fact, neutrality was the key point. Everything else was simply rhetoric and political seasoning about denazification and Russian-speaking populations, blah, blah, blah. The blah, blah, blah was him. That's not me editorializing there. So, this is important because a lot of people said, oh, we can't have Ukraine agree because Russia's asking for a regime change. And he's saying that that wasn't true. They were just asking for neutrality. The high-ranking official explained that Kiev was unlikely to accept Putin's offer during the talks in Istanbul because the Ukrainian leadership did not believe Russia could be trusted. However, he went on to say that then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson cemented Kiev's path on fighting a long war with Russia. So he said the deal could have been done if there were security guarantees. We could not sign something, step away, everyone would relax, and then they would invade even more prepared because they have in fact gone in unprepared for such a resistance, he said. Moreover, when we returned from Istanbul, Boris Johnson came to Kiev and said that we would not sign anything with them at all, and let's just fight. So these are, I guess, kind of the points in here that are really important. He's saying that Ukraine could have only accepted the neutrality agreement if it signed security guarantees with the West, which the West said that they weren't going to sign. And as Boris Johnson later says, they're not signing on to anything here. And so, there was a way for this war to end in March of 22 that it didn't end because the West didn't want it to. As he says, when we returned from Istanbul, Boris Johnson came to Kiev and said that we would not sign anything with them and let's just fight. So, he's, I think, really saying there that at the end, it's this, Boris Johnson visit that really pushes them over the edge and cements this idea that fighting is the way to go. Now, one other thing here is he kind of says Russia would invade even more prepared because they were unprepared for the resistance that they faced. This is kind of interesting and something that I've talked about over the course of the war, that I'm not sure Russia really wanted to invade. And once they did, the original initial plan really wasn't regime change in Kiev, but to, get the neutrality concession, which they were unable to do. So the Ukrainian official explained that while Kiev's Western backers did not discourage talk, they advised against accepting a deal. He said, they actually advised us not to go the infernal security guarantees, which could not have been given at that time at all. And so, he's saying that they said not to trust Russia, but they didn't say, and they wouldn't sign security guarantees, but they didn't say you couldn't not trust Russia. The statement In the interview, confirmed several reports from other officials in Russia, Turkey, and the US that a deal was offered by the Kremlin in the early days of the war to withdraw Russian forces to the pre-war lines in exchange for Kiev's vow to never join NATO. Now, after 20 months of war, Ukraine's Western backers are discussing Kiev's opening dialogue with Moscow. Since the talks in the early months of the conflict, Russia has annexed 4 regions of Ukraine, suggesting Moscow is likely to demand more territorial concessions than what was on the table for Kiev in March of last year. All right, another article here on the war in Ukraine. This one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on November 26th. Financial Times: Ukraine is running low on manpower, sets up checkpoints to conscript draft evaders. So the Financial Times reports that Kiev is quickly depleting Ukraine's pool of young men to conscript into its army. To add to its ranks, Kiev has set up checkpoints to catch potential draft evaders. The outlet says that Ukraine is struggling to train its soldiers and has begun drafting young men who previously qualified for medical waivers. The outlet reports to help fill the ranks, Ukrainian officials have set up roadside checkpoints to seek men evading the draft. If they are deemed fit, they are whisked off to draft offices. Online videos of recruitment officers picking men off the streets and forcing them into minivans have gone viral. General Volushny, the commander of Ukrainian forces, explained that Kiev is struggling to train a reserve force. He said, "However, our capacity to train reserves on our own country territory is also limited. We cannot easily spare soldiers who are deployed to the front, and Russia can strike training centers. And there are gaps in our legislation that allow citizens to evade their responsibilities." Ukrainian soldiers have been trained by a multitude of NATO member nations. In total, the European Union plans to train over 30,000 Ukrainians in 2023. In France, the trainers attempt not to get too close to the Ukrainians, who will likely be killed or wounded once they return to the conflict. The Associated Press reported that Ukrainian soldiers preparing for deployment from France to the front have resigned themselves to the grimness of the future. And that's a quote there. In an effort to fill its ranks, Kiev has expanded its draft to include men who previously received medical deferments. Additionally, the Ukrainian army is increasingly made up of older soldiers. Jack Walting, a senior fellow at the Royal United Service Institute, a UK think tank, told the Financial Times that the average age of Ukrainians at the front and those trained by Western allies has been 30 to 40 rather than 18 to 24, adding that the issue is not troop quantity but quality and capacity to command operations at scale. Franz Stefan Grady, senior fellow for the International Institute of Strategic Studies, explained to the outlet, Ukrainians' infantry in top physical shape. The physical requirements for infantry are demanding, have increased in this conflict, has settled into small-scale infantry engagement, fought on foot in trench systems. So, they're just saying that the troops are too old to do what they need them to do. Kiev has also offered high salaries and promises of becoming drone operators rather than frontline soldiers to draw more Ukrainians to recruitment centers. The Ukrainian mobilization offices have been plagued with massive corruption. Over the summer, President Zelensky dismissed dozens of recruitment officials, alleging they accepted $1 million in bribes in order to give inappropriate draft referrals. In recent months, Kiev has engaged in a counteroffensive aimed at severing the Russian hold on southern Ukraine. Ukrainian forces made insignificant gains, but suffered substantial losses to troops and equipment. Washington knew that would be the likely result of the Ukrainian offensive, but pushed Kiev to conduct the operations anyways. All right, now let's move on. We got one quick article here on the tensions with China before we move on to news about the war in Gaza. China calls U.S. Disruptor appeased after warship encounter in South China Sea. So China has called the U.S. the biggest disruptor of peace in the South China Sea after a U.S. warship sailed near Chinese-controlled islands in the disputed waters. The U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet said Saturday that a guided missile destroyer, the USS Hopper, sailed near the Parcel Islands, known as the Shisha Islands in China, in an operation known as Freedom of Navigation Operations, which are called FONOPs. The U.S. regularly began conducting FONOPs to challenge China's claim in the South China Sea in 2015. The area where the USS Hopper conducted the FONOP is claimed by Taiwan and Vietnam, according to the South China Morning Post. The Chinese military said it was warned off by the U.S. warship after it entered the Shisha's territorial waters, which extend 12 nautical miles from a coastline. The serious violation of China's sovereignty and security by the United States is further iron proof that it is pursuing a navigation hegemony and creating militarization of the South China Sea. And that was a statement from China's PLA's Southern Theater Command. Going on, it fully provides the United States is an out and out security risk creator of the South China Sea and the biggest disruptor of peace and stability in the South China Sea. And of course, if you look at how far the U.S. is from the South China Sea, you kind of understand why the Chinese feel this way. All right. Next up here, the ceasefire in the pause in fighting in Gaza is working out. There have been some delays to getting the hostages released, but every day those commitments have been met, and it looks like the agreement will at least pause fighting for the initial 4-day period. However, it could be extended. So this is maybe some better news. Hamas says it wants to extend truce with Israel after prisoner swap. So Hamas said Sunday that it's ready to extend a 4-day truce with Israel after the two sides exchanged prisoners for the third straight day. The Hamas statement said the Islamic resistance movement Hamas seeks to extend the truce after 4-day period ends through serious efforts to increase the number of those released from imprisonment as stipulated in the humanitarian ceasefire agreement. The hostage deal allows an extension in the 4-day truce in exchange for Hamas releasing more hostages. Earlier in the day, Hamas source told AFP that the group could potentially release 20 to 40 more Israelis. Qatar, which brokered the agreement, said Hamas needs to locate dozens of Israeli women and children who are held in Gaza by other groups in order to extend the pause in fighting. And so, a couple things. There may be some logistical challenges here for Hamas, so hopefully they have looked ahead and are not scrambling at the last minute, because I don't think they're going to get, many extensions on a deadline from Israel as far as trying to turn up these hostages after the 4-day period, which should be Tuesday morning, would end. And then the second question I kind of have is, and maybe this is laid out and explained in the wording of the agreement that we haven't seen, is that we know that Israel has been releasing Palestinians that are essentially political prisoners held in Israel in exchange for Hamas releasing some hostages as well. And so you kind of wonder if Israel would continue the release of Palestinians held in Israel, and then also just about aid deliveries, because that was the other thing that Hamas was, or not Hamas really, but the people of Gaza were really getting here was aid shipments coming in to Gaza as this pause in fighting was going on. So the Israeli side has also expressed interest in extending the 4-day truce if Hamas releases more prisoners, while making it clear they will continue once the pause is over. So the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke with President Biden on Sunday and said his government is willing to extend the ceasefire for 1 day for every 10 hostages that Hamas releases. Netanyahu also told Biden that at the end of the deal, we are returning to full power to carry out aims, destroy Hamas, ensure Gaza won't return to what it was, and of course to free all of our hostages. And so if they keep releasing hostages to extend the agreement, then that would be achieved without fighting. But That's not really Netanyahu's thinking. So far during the first 3 days of the hostages release, and by the time some of you are listening to this, they may have already gone through with their fourth day of releases. So these numbers might not be the most up to date, but Hamas has released 58 hostages, including 14 Thai nationals who gained their freedom as part of a separate agreement with Bangkok. 17 hostages were released on Sunday, including a 4-year-old American citizen. Israel has released 117 Palestinians, the majority being women and children or people who were detained when they were minors. On Saturday, Hamas said it would stop releasing hostages unless Israel lived up to its commitment to allow more aid trucks into Gaza, but the group began freeing hostages later that day, and the deal has continued since then. Before the truce came into effect, the U.S. officials told the Times of Israel that Israel would likely not be able to live up to its pledge to allow 200 aid trucks into Gaza per day, since it refused to open its border crossing with the enclave. The truce in Gaza has held up relatively well, besides Israeli forces firing on displaced Palestinians attempting to return to northern Gaza. But over in the West Bank, violence has continued. Over the weekend, Israeli forces killed 8 people during raids in the West Bank, bringing the total of Palestinians killed in the occupied territory to 239 since October 7th. Now, talk about the situation inside Gaza humanitarian. This is the UN World Food Program warning Gaza is on the brink of famine. So Cindy McCain, yes, that is the widow of John McCain, who is now the head of the United Nations World Food Program, the WFP, said on CBS's Face the Nation, first of all, the bottom line here is that we need to get more aid in. As have been said, we are looking at possibly being on the brink of famine in this region. This is something that will spread, and with that comes disease and everything else that you can imagine. It's a massive, catastrophic event that is occurring, and it will cross regions as it happens. We got to be able to get in there, and not only that, we have to make sure that we can safely access and be able to feed the people that we need to feed. So far, we've fed about 1,000 or 110,000 since the start of the ceasefire, but we need to do a lot more than that. And there's hundreds of thousands of people at UN shelters, so that's not very, very promising that they've only fed 100,000 of them. So, and look, the staff of the WFP, and McCain has been saying that, like, hey, there's not enough aid and things getting like that in there, but her staff say that she is not doing enough and have actually released a letter calling on McCain to step down from her post over her lack of a call for a ceasefire. All right. Next up here, we have this one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Biden moves to lift restrictions on Israel's access to U.S. weapons stockpiles. So President Biden is looking to remove restrictions on Israel's access to weapons and ammunitions the U.S. has stored in Israel. And this was a report from The Intercept on Saturday. I believe Ken Klippenstein wrote this up for them. The U.S. military maintains a reserve stockpile of arms in Israel known as the War Reserve Stockpile Allies-Israel, so WRSA-I. Israel has gained access to WRSA-I during previous conflicts under rules that were set forth by the White House, but that the White House now wants to eliminate. The White House included the lifting of restrictions in its emergency supplemental request and made to Congress on October 20th for approximately $105 billion to fund Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. This is what Schumer wants to hold a vote on next week. Under current restrictions, the U.S. can only transfer weapons and ammunitions to the WRSA-I that are obsolete or surplus. The White House's request would eliminate that requirement and allow for the transfer of all categories of defense articles. The request would scrap the requirement for Israel to make certain concessions to access the stockpile by giving the Pentagon greater flexibility in determining the value of the concessions provided in exchange for the transfers. It would remove congressional oversight by eliminating the requirement of providing a 30-day notice before a weapons transfer. The request would also do away with a $200 million annual cap on spending to replenish WRSA-I. Josh Paul, who recently resigned from the State Department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs over Biden's support for Israel's Gaza onslaught, told The Intercept that lifting the restrictions would create an essentially free-flowing pipeline to provide any defense articles to Israel by the simple act of placing them in the WRSA-I stockpile or other stockpiles intended for Israel. Paul also said that doing away with the restrictions could impact the U.S. military readiness. By dropping the requirements that such articles be declared in access, it would also increase the existing strain on U.S. military readiness in order to provide more arms to Israel. All right, here. Next up, this is a absolutely heartbreaking story here. I hate covering this. Israel is using U.S.-provided weapons to kill Palestinians at a historic pace. So the New York Times reported on Saturday that Israel is killing Palestinians in Gaza at a historic pace. The huge civilian death toll in Gaza is explained by the scale of the bombing campaign and Israel's willingness to use U.S.-provided 2,000-pound bombs in densely populated areas that are packed with civilians. Mark Garoslau, a former Pentagon analyst who advises the Dutch NGO PATS, told the Times that he's never seen anything like it. It's beyond anything that I've ever seen in my career, he said, adding that to find a historical comparison for so many large bombs being used in such a small area, one would need to go back to Vietnam or the Second World War. Israeli officials have frequently cited the Allied strategic bombing of Japan and Germany during World War II to justify their onslaught in Gaza. The comparison includes the U.S. firebombing of Japanese cities, which had killed around 100,000 civilians in Tokyo in one night in 1945, as well as the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Israel has also invoked the U.S. air campaign against ISIS, which killed tens of thousands of civilians in Iraq and Syria. But even as the most brutal battle of the ISIS war does not compare to the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. According to an AP investigation, between 9,000 and 11,000 civilians died during the Battle of Mosul. About a third were killed by the U.S. coalition airstrikes or Iraqi forces. A third were killed by ISIS, and the rest of the deaths were undetermined. The Battle of Mosul lasted for 9 months. From October 2016 to July of 2017. In less than 2 months in Gaza, the Israeli bombardment has killed at least 10,000 civilians, based on a conservative estimate cited by the Times. The Times report noted that people are being killed in Gaza more quickly, they say, than even in the deadliest moments of the U.S.-led attacks in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, which themselves were regularly criticized by human rights groups. The Israeli onslaught also dwarfs the civilian casualties in the war on Ukraine since Russia invaded in February of 22. In 1 year of war, in 1 year of 9 months in fighting, the UN estimates that at least 10,000 civilians have been killed in Ukraine, including just 560 children. The last update released by the Gaza Health Ministry on November 10th, after just 35 days of the Israeli campaign, said that over 4,500 Palestinian children have been killed in Gaza, which the U.S. State Department acknowledged was considered to be a low estimate at the time. Despite the massive civilian and child death toll, the U.S. continues to provide Israel with unconditioned military support. The White House says that Israel is killing thousands of innocent people in Gaza, but has said that there are no red lines that would impact U.S. support. And I did read this morning, because people have been asking me this, about how many members of Hamas Israel has killed. According to The Guardian, Israel estimates that it's only 1,000 to 2,000. So they are killing, between probably 2 and 4 children for every one member of Hamas that they kill. All right, Last story here before we wrap up today. Israeli airstrike puts Syria's Damascus airport out of service. This happens a lot. This from Day to Camp at antiwar.com. Israeli airstrikes again targeted Syria's Damascus airports on Sunday, putting it out of service, Syria's news agency Sana reported. At approximately 4:50 on Sunday afternoon, the Zionist enemy carried out an air aggression with missiles from the direction of the occupied Syrian Golan, targeting Damascus International Airport and some points in Damascus countryside. The statement said, Israel began frequently targeting Syria's airports in Damascus and Aleppo last summer, but the attacks have ramped up since October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel and the start of Israel's onslaught in Gaza. Ruda, which I believe is an Iraqi Kurdish outlet, or maybe just a Kurdish outlet, reported on Saturday that the Damascus airport was set to resume service after being inoperable for over a month due to an Israeli airstrike in October. The UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says flights resumed Sunday morning, just hours before Israel bombed the airport and knocked it out of service again. Israeli officials have justified the Israeli airstrikes on Syria's airports by claiming they receive Iranian weapon shipments, but the airports are also used by civilians. Earlier this year, Israeli airstrikes on the Aleppo airport disturbed aid deliveries following a devastating earthquake that killed thousands of civilians. And, this was a big deal in the international press for a couple of days before people stopped caring about the Syrians and the Turks that were killed in that earthquake. So Israel frames its broader bombing campaign in Syria as operations against Iran and Hezbollah, and it's fighting their presence. Although the airstrikes frequently kill Syrians and damage civilian infrastructure, before October 7th, Israel had bombed Syria at least 25 times this year, so I'm sure that number has maybe even close to doubled since then. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. Again, holding our fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. So if you like our stuff, please head on over now before you forget and make a donation. It really helps us out, and we will see you later in the week.